Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Let's see where we're at here. So we've got assignment number 1. I was going to grade that today, and then I got sidetracked with some other things. But I have time first thing in the morning, so I can make sure to get that graded. I know that was due, I think, last week. Yeah. So I'll make sure to have that graded tomorrow. Assignment number 2 is due, I think, today. Yeah. So how many people already finished assignment number 2? Okay, so I'll give you some more time in class for those that weren't able to finish that. And then assignment number 3 is a little bit different than what we've done before. So we're going to do a topic today called Flexbox. And it's sort of one of these things that it's like you have to practice. And I could have you do a project, but it's like you just kind of use the most common use case in a project. So this is kind of cool. They actually have this, and this is not that common in programming. They have an actual game. I want to say Twitter created it. Okay, so a few organizations. But it's pretty cool because, and I'm guessing they made it because a lot of people, so we're going to learn this thing today called Flexbox, but it's kind of cool because you can actually code and make this frog go different parts of the screen. Remember that this course, the main focus is layouts, essentially putting things in different places on the screen. Now, historically, most of what you've learned in this course would be very, very simple layouts, things like centering things. But now you can do interesting things like if you want to put something in the upper right-hand corner, you can do that. So we'll learn this today, but and you can do interesting things like that with a single line of code. Now, because this is a very popular game, I'll tell you right now the answers are already out there. I've used this for a couple semesters. Please don't cheat. This is going to be the deciding semester. If people cheat this semester, I'm just going to stop using it. It's a super good resource. Like the first semester I used it, everyone was overwhelmingly happy because it gives you a lot of practice on something that's not conceptually that easy. There's a very steep learning curve. And what I used to do was give like an assignment how to use it, but you don't really get good practice unless you do in this case 13 different levels. The only really way to get good at it is to do a bunch of small examples. Because again, there's a very steep learning curve. You just got to get used to the terminology. So again, if anybody cheats in here, obviously as usual, it's an automatic 0, but I'm going to be extra harsh on this assignment because I'm telling you, I'm going to be honest with you, the answers are out there. I've caught people cheating in the past. And if it gets to the point that somebody else cheats, I'm just going to stop using it in the future. So by cheating, it's like you're just ruining it for everybody. Okay, so being very clear on that. Okay, everyone gets that? So you as one person cheating, it's like you're going to ruin it for a bunch of other people. But the people who have gone through it doesn't take that super long to do. Maybe an hour, hour and a half, and probably closer to the 1 hour side. Have found it super, super, super helpful. So that's why I decided to give it one more try this semester. So I think that's it. So let's go ahead and I'm streaming, haven't dropped any frames or anything. So the topic we're going to talk about, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. I'll go to resources. Up to this point, and not just this course, but all of your HTML and web classes, the general theme has been learning HTML, so the structure, learning some CSS, but usually when you're learning CSS, it's for things like colors and fonts and margins, maybe being able to center something in the middle of the page like we did before. Remember we created a fixed width box and then set the margin to auto, and you can cause that to go to the center of the page. But your layouts have been fairly limited. Now, if you remember at the end of last class, we did some navigation. And then remember how just in a few lines of code, we took that list, we're able to style it. And more importantly, we were able to do some really interesting layout things where we said, okay, instead of making it laid out as a column, make it flow as a row. And then, okay, well, within that, I wanted to spread things out evenly. And just in a couple lines of code, we were able to do some really cool things with that. That was Flexbox. But again, like I said, there's a very steep learning curve. Now, unfortunately, the W3 Schools stuff on Flexbox is not that great. As you can see here, it's actually relatively new. So you can see here, W3C candidate, October 2017. I actually started teaching Flexbox before it was even standardized because I just saw how powerful it was. I've been doing the web for a very, very long time. And I've just seen over the years bad attempt after bad attempt to try to make layouts easier. And this and something else called Grid are honestly the first time, and I don't know how many years I've been doing this, that I feel like there's actually something that's making layouts easy. Before, just layouts were a giant headache every time. Again, the learning curve is a little bit steep. You have to invest some time, but once you get used to it, you can do really, really cool things. The most common use cases are going to be yeah, so Mozilla has a thing here I was looking at earlier. So if I want to do something as simple as just kind of the navigation like we did last week, but then you can do interesting navigation where you've got part of the navigation kind of split. So this might be like links, but then on the right-hand side, you might have a login button. This is really amazing. You wouldn't believe how difficult this was centering something both vertically and horizontally. So we've already done horizontal centering. If you remember, we could just make a fixed width box and set margin to auto. But centering it vertically is actually amazingly difficult without Flexbox. But as you can see here, it's incredibly simple. All we do is turn on Flexbox and we say, okay, I want essentially the horizontal and vertical axis centered, and just puts it in the middle. We have these things called cards. I don't think we've done cards in here yet, have we? I wanted to introduce Flexbox a little bit sooner this semester. But this is very common, is that you've got some content in here, but you want the footers to line up. So an example of a card would be probably misspelling it. These are a good example of cards. So say, for example, you wanted the read more to all line up. You could do that with Flexbox. See here? And again, it's very, very simple. But some of this stuff probably seems like magic. It's like, okay, 1-1 auto, what does that mean? Okay. So it's relatively new, but most browsers are supporting it. We haven't gone over the Can I Use site, have we? So there's a very cool site. It's called Can I Use? And you basically type in the thing, and it tells you, based on statistics of web browsers, using a certain feature, how many web browsers support it. Yeah, so this is the one we're concerned about. So this is pretty decent adoption, 95% globally. All the major browsers, IE has essentially been abandoned, so I wouldn't worry too much about IE. looks like pretty much most of the major browsers. Let's say, for example, Chrome's usually a pretty early adopter, but let's say even Firefox. So since 2014. Okay, so it's pretty safe to use at this point, I think. Maybe the only exception might be if like you worked in government or something like that. You knew, like you saw these stats and you're like, well, if I can't leave out 3% of the city from being able to, or the state from being able to use my website, if it's got like government services or something like that. But for most typical use cases, government's usually an exception. Government, you have to really hit that like 99.99% mark. But this is to me, this is pretty good. And even though if I think it got recommended as a standard in like I think it said 2017, actually browsers have been supporting it for a while. I think what you had to do was at the time like turn on a special like experimental mode or something in your settings. But you can see here Chrome has been using it for a long time. Okay. So Flexbox is for layouts. It's short for flexible box, which probably doesn't mean a whole lot. And the main idea is, well, let's take it. Talk about terminology first, because I think they're talking terminology too soon. So we have this idea of a main container. And I think we've created a container class before. And the idea is with a container class, it's very generic. A container just means that I've got a bunch of items in it. Okay, so we've got this, I kind of think of it as one parent container, and that's going to contain a bunch of children. So last week with our links, our nav might have been the parent, or let's say our UL might have been the parent, and then our individual LIs, those would be the items. Does that make sense? And what we do on that parent, we set a special property called display. And we set it to flex. And then just by doing that, it turns on a bunch of defaults. Okay, so let's go ahead and just doing that, let's go ahead and start up an example here. So let's make a new folder for today. To 10/20/20. Open up brackets. We'll use our HTML shell code. File new, save, ex1.html. So give everyone a little bit to catch up. That's where we want to be, where we have an ex1.html. Now, as we're doing this, we're going to do a lot of very isolated examples that may not make sense, but think about use cases. So think, how could I use this in navigation? Bless you. So how could I use this in navigation, like we did last week? And how could I use this in cards? These things right here. This is a very common use case for Flexbox. I'll just wait a second, make sure everyone's caught up. So inside of head, put our style tag. And we're going to have a container class, and then we're going to have an item class. And the container is going to display flex. Remember to turn on Flexbox. And the items can have different properties. Actually, so these examples tend to work best when we have kind of a box. So let's do that. So we're going to have a width of, let's say, 200 pixels. Height. Did I mistype something? Because it's kind of, there we go. Okay. So with 200, and then I like to do this border radius because you can tell a little bit easier when the boxes are up against each other. So border radius, 5 pixels, let's try that. Let's go larger, we'll say 10 pixels. That might be too hard. But we'll see, I guess. And a background color. And something very bright. Yeah, I think four screen will show up on the screen pretty well. So we've got a container class, and that's going to contain things. Think back to our example from the navigation last week where we had an unordered list. So the UL would be the container in that case, and we would set its display to flex, and then the individual LIs, the list items, would be the items. Now inside of body, let's go ahead and set this up. I'm going to be very generic. I'm just going to use divs all class today because it just makes life a little bit easier because we don't have to really think about what each thing means. So here we're going to say class is container. And then let's add 4 items. So we'll have div class equals item. And 4 seems like a pretty good number. Hopefully you can see why I did this border radius. So let's also do border as 1 pixel solid. There, that makes it a little bit easier. So normally the content wants to flow vertically, but we can see just by adding that display flex, all of a sudden it's displaying horizontally. So we have this property called flex direction. By default, it wants to go in the row direction. But if we wanted it to, so if we don't specify anything, it assumes row. But if we set it ourselves, in brackets is nice because it gives you your options. Let's do column. So just with this one property, we can either have the content flow in the row or column direction. So I need to introduce some terminology. We have what's known as, because certain properties have different contexts based on whether it's a row or a column. So what I mean is right now, it's only taking up as much space in this direction as it needs to. What if we wanted to take up to space evenly? Remember how we did that with the navigation in the other direction where we had it kind of fill the width? We can do the same thing here. We can't use terminology like X and Y because what happens when I change it from row to column? X and Y are flipped. So it gets kind of confusing. So what they talk about is main axis and cross axis. And the main axis kind of flips. So let's take a step back here. So if I set this to row, this is the direction of the main axis and the row direction. And then the cross axis is this way. What happens to the main axis and cross axis when I changed it to column? They're flipped. So now, which direction is the main axis? This direction, correct? And then which way is the cross axis? Horizontally. So they flipped. The reason this is important is because we have some of these other properties that like justify content. Well, this is when it's in the row direction. Kind of mentally think, and we'll go over some of these examples. Mentally think what would happen to this if we set it in the column direction. And by the way, that's one of these things that Flexbox Frogs, that game is pretty good at, is rather than having to mentally think about this, you're actually putting frogs on the screen at those locations. But here, if I do space between, it's going to be like our horizontal navigation. But if I set it to column, it's going to be this, the space is going to be this way. Okay, so make sure you'll hear me use the terminology main axis and cross axis, and you have to know the context of whether I'm talking about whether we're flexed in the row or column direction. We're going to reuse a lot of these examples over and over and over again because it's just, we're going to take these boxes and just kind of put them in a bunch of different layouts. Okay, so I want to take about a minute. I just want to make sure everyone has this typed out because what we're going to do is almost every single example, we're going to do Command A, Command C, and then paste that into the next example. Okay, so make sure that you have this because if you don't, you're going to fall behind. So I'll sit here at style for a minute. Actually, I think everything fits on screen right now. Yeah. Everyone's good? Okay, so let's do that. So do Command A, Command C, and paste it into a new example, and this is going to be ex2.html. So let's explore this property, justify content. So right now it's set to column. By default, if we don't specify anything, it's going to be row, but let's just put row so we know that we're working with row. That way you visually see it. It's not just kind of implicit. So here we have example 2. It's flexing in the row direction. And if you remember, we actually kind of touched on this on the navigation. So what we can do is we can set this property called justify content. And so this property we set on the container. Just as a quick note, this CSS trick site, this is really cool. This is like probably one of the best, to this day, still one of the best resources for just a bunch of cool examples on Flexbox. But the stuff on the left applies to container. And then the stuff on the right applies to items. So they laid it out really well. So if you ever see my mouse on the left, if we're talking about something on the left-hand side, that means that we're talking about that we apply it to the parent, and then by putting it in the parent, it applies to all the children. So we were on justify content. So on the container, if I set justify content, whatever I set here, this is how it's going to lay out the children. Okay, so we can center it. Let's start with center. That one's probably the most intuitive. Centers it in the middle of the screen. Hopefully you can see how that would be useful. To me, this is a lot cleaner than our fixed width div with setting margin to auto. That's not super intuitive. This way, this is just 2 lines of code. I just set it to display flex and justify content center. I don't even actually have to worry about making it fixed width anymore. In this case, because we didn't have anything in there, we had to make it fixed width. But if we just happen to have a bunch of content in there like lorem ipsum and stuff, we wouldn't even have to really worry about it would kind of take care of itself. So this is a much better method of centering things where we once might have used margin auto. Yes?
If you were to set the flex direction to column, would it center the column?
Yes, sort of. Well, so everyone's good with this, right? And let's actually do that. Let's explore one here. We'll do space between. That's a very good question. So let's do space between. So now the question is if I set this to column, is it going to do the same thing in the column direction? Well, so you might think it doesn't work. It does, but the full answer is kind of non-intuitive. So don't change your code. I want to watch. That's actually a really great question that you asked that, because it's not super intuitive, the reason why. So let me set it back to row. And the way to really understand it is we have to go back to our developer tools. So if I hover over, let me set it to center temporarily. It'll make it explaining this a little bit easier. So if you notice, when I hover over the div, how much space is the div taking up? Is it taking up that entire, think of it maybe as like a line or that entire row, right? I couldn't really, unless I get into floats and stuff, I couldn't kind of sneak something in over here, correct? Because this div, this container div is taking up the whole thing. Now, when I set the flex direction to column, the way the web works is when I hover over this container, notice how much it's taking up. Is it taking up the full height of the page? It's taking up as much as it needs to. So by default, what happens is that your page only takes up as much as it needs to. Now there's a simple workaround, but it's actually doing what it needs to. So what you're telling it to do is you're saying, I want to center this vertically, but the problem is that you've already run out of space. So the concept of centering it or spacing evenly, it doesn't really make sense because by default, your page is only going to take up as much as it needs to. You've probably discovered this when you, did anybody try to set a footer, or have you done a footer before and it's kind of like in the middle of the page?
Yeah.
So what you have to do is you have to kind of push all that down. You have to kind of specify that, hey, I want the height of the page to be the full height. So the way you can do that is, I think you can set it just on the body. And what you want to say is I want to take up 100% of the viewport height. Has anybody seen this property before? VH for viewport height. So the idea of a viewport is it's just your screen. So this right here, this whole thing would be the viewport. Now, you can't really specify this in pixels because everyone's got different sized screens. So that's what it does for you, is it actually goes and discovers the number of pixels in that viewport, essentially your screen, and it takes care of it for you. So now I'm pretty sure just setting the viewport height will do it. Let's see. I think we might have to set it on both HTML and that. Let's try that. Let's go over here. Thanks. Hold on. I might have to Google this one. Sorry. Flexbox. Or maybe we can just use 100%. Hold on. Let's try. Oh, and then I think on top of it, the container also has to be set to 100%. So let's also try that. There we go. Okay. So basically what sorry, I had to look stuff up. I know it interrupts kind of the flow of teaching when I have to do that. So what I had to do was say for the HTML and body tags. So this right here, and I think let me take a step back. Let me see if I can get away with just body. I think I might be able to get away just with body. Perfect. Okay. So this body right here, this body tag, it's saying, okay, take up the full viewport height. Take 100% of the height. Now here, because this already expanded to the full size of the screen, then we can actually use percentages. We don't actually have to use this viewport height. So what we said is expand the container. Now, if we want to justify content, space, say around, or the other property, space between, we can do that. I hope that example wasn't overly complicated. Does anybody need me to go just kind of summarize that one more time? Okay, so let me just take a step back. Okay, so we started off just doing our flex direction in the row direction. And that, I think, for most people is pretty intuitive, because what happens is when we have a block level tag, that block level tag takes up that entire row. It takes the entire width, and then the next thing you put, where's it going to be? It's going to be down here. It's going to be below it, because this takes up the whole thing, regardless of whether it's spaced between or center. A div is a block level tag, and it's going to take up the whole thing. Inline, it wouldn't have, but because the div is a block level tag, it took up this whole thing. So that means that we have space left over for Flexbox to work with. However, when we put it in the column direction, we ran into the problem that by default, our page only takes up as much height as it needs to. So what we had to do is we had to force it and say, I know your default behavior is to only take up as much vertical height as you need to, but what I'm telling you is take up the full, what's called the viewport, essentially your screen, take up that full screen height. Then what we had to do, that wasn't enough because the container itself, again, only takes up as much as it needs to. So what we had to do is down here, yeah, this is set to the full height, but this isn't. This is still taking up as much room as it needs to. So we also needed to set this to the full height. Because we expanded the parent all the way out, then we can just kind of use this height is 100%, and that works out there. Is everyone good? Now, again, don't forget that depending on our context, the main axis and cross axis gets flipped. So right now, which direction is the main axis? Is it up and down, or is it left and right? So for right now, which direction is the main axis? Vertical, exactly. It's up and down. Which direction is the cross axis? Horizontal, exactly. And so in this case, this property, this justify content, this is the effect that it has on the main axis. But then when you set it to column, it still has this effect, but it's kind of in the other direction. Okay, any questions about this? I know like I said, it's a early on it's a steep learning curve, but you get used to it. Bless you again. Okay, so let's take this example. So really quick, everyone has all this copied down. So you've got all your CSS is good. And you've got your HTML. Okay, let's keep on going here. Let's copy it. So we're copying example 2, and then we're going to put that in example 3. Now, to be perfectly honest, the most common usage and the most common properties are justify content and this other property called align items. So let's explore align items a little bit more. So let's start off with align items in the row direction. And we're actually going to get rid of justify content because we don't really particularly care. And I'm going to get rid of this for now, this 100% height, because I think it's going to cause problems if we don't. We can leave it on the body. So right now we've just got our display flex direction is row, and we actually haven't modified any of these items just yet. So what I want to do is this next example isn't going to really make sense unless we have stuff inside of these divs, like actual text, because you'll notice that some of these properties, it'll make sense once they have some text in it. So let's do that. Let's grab some lorem ipsum text, toss that in, and it only really makes sense if you have paragraphs of different lengths. So make sure that all 4 of your divs, you can use the same paragraph and then just like chop it up so it's a little bit smaller. But the main idea is that they should be different lengths. So I'll make this one really short. I know it's not fitting on the screen anymore, but again, the basic idea is just that those same 4 items, now we've got text inside of them. And the text needs to be of different length or else it's not gonna really demo very well. And we can view it, but I don't think there's going to be anything terribly interesting. Oh, and then the other thing we want to do is, because we've got stuff inside of those divs, we don't want to have a fixed width height or a fixed height anymore. So what we have to do is after you paste that in, because now we've actually got content in there, we don't need to fix the height anymore. So inside of item, get rid of that height property. And so right now it should look like this. So align items. This orange part right here is essentially, this is going to be the text. So the default, so this defines the default behavior on flex items are laid out along the cross axis. Think of it as justify content for the cross axis. So the default for this is, I want to say it's, I think it's just flex start. So inside of the container, we'll do align items. And let's set it to flex end. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I think by default it's actually stretch. We'll go through them, but I think it's actually stretch. So you'll notice here that we're able to align it based on, I guess you could say, the bottom. But again, it's like, it depends on which direction you're flowing, whether you're in the row or column direction. But in this case, you can see here, so they tend to use terms like start and end rather than top and bottom. So this is at the end. Here it's aligning. Let's look at I think the default is this one right here, stretch. So let's go ahead and set that. So let's set it to stretch. Yeah, so this is how we started off, is that these 4 boxes are the same height. It's stretched out the boxes in the main axis. I'm sorry. It's stretched them out in the cross axis because right now we're row. So it's stretched them out in the cross axis to be as large as the largest thing. So notice how this one is the largest. The text still only takes up as much as the text needs to, but the actual div containing it stretches out all the way. Now flex start that's not the case anymore. So the text is still the exact same height, but the box containing it, so that div, that only takes up as much space as it needs to. And we already saw flex end. And we also have, try out center here as well. So now let's, so any questions on this? So you, again, like it said, you can kind of think of it as the, how did they word it? You can think of it as justify content in the cross-access, okay? By the way, Flexbox has actually been super influential. Like most CSS frameworks these days are Flexbox based. There's a framework called Flutter from Google, and the layouts are pretty much mostly in Flexbox. They cleaned up the terminology, which is nice. Instead of using the word, like they actually use the word main access and cross access, they cleaned it up a little bit. But Flexbox is actually expanding out into other things that don't even necessarily have to do with the web directly. Okay. So everyone's good with this example? So let's take this. And I already told you that one of the most difficult things used to be just centering stuff in the middle of the screen. So let's get ourselves down to just a single div, or maybe let's make it a div. Keep it very generic. And let's get our container here to where it's only got one item. It just says hello. Let's get rid of its width. So it's just going to take up, and because we also get rid of height, it's just going to take as much space as it needs to. And let me show you an example of where we use justify content and align items. So now if I want to center something in the middle of the page, just like before, I had to set the height of body to 100 to the full viewport height. The container, I also am going to want to set the height to 100%. And remember, the reason we had to do this is because by default it wants to, in the vertical direction, only wants to take up as much space as needed. So we have to force it to take up the full height of the viewport. And then we have to fill that with our container. But all we're doing here, it's relatively simple. Once we expand that full viewport height, all we're doing is saying line items center, justify content in center. And just with that, now we can actually put things in the middle of the page. That doesn't look terribly great, but you might put an image in there or something. So if your site had like a large image that you wanted to center exactly in the middle of the page, this used to take. There was a million different techniques. You could do it with JavaScript, and JavaScript could report back the monitor size. And But now this is amazing that we can just do that in pure CSS. And maybe we can make this an H1 instead, so it's a little bit more appropriate rather than just a div. You could add padding if you wanted to. But you get the idea. Yeah.
So like with my example, I just kept like a small paragraph. So it's actually, well, it's not a small paragraph. It's like 6 sentences, but it's stretched out like the whole width of the, I guess, main axis. That would be. Yeah.
In that case, you'd have to give it a fixed. Then you'd have to choose how much of a width you would want. So let's say, for example, if I grabbed another paragraph here. Now, to be in practice, you usually use this with an image or a single line of text, something very short that says like "Welcome to the site." But in this case, if you ran into this, there's a couple different choices you can make. What you could do on the width is say, maybe I just want the width to be only take up about half.
Okay.
So you'd have different options, or you could actually specify a pixel value, or maybe just a quarter.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's fine.
You'd think something as simple as just putting something in the middle of the page would have been solved 20 years ago, but it's not really till Flexbox that it's been simple. So it's been possible for a really long time with JavaScript, but the nice thing about some of these layout things is that this is stuff that we used to have to accomplish with JavaScript, and so it meant that it was not really accessible for people that didn't know JavaScript or were not like super fluent in it. Or what we used to see a lot of is like people copying and pasting JavaScript, not knowing what the code actually does. It's like, oh, somebody else wrote this and this kind of puts the stuff in the middle of the screen. Let me just paste it in my site. But to me, again, it's a little bit of a steep learning curve, but once you've got the core concepts down, the actual code, there's not really that much code here. We're just saying it's really these 4 lines, but the second line is already implicit, so it's actually really just 3 lines of code. We're saying turn on Flexbox, center it in the main axis, center it in the cross axis, and then we're done. Okay, so there's some other things here. Now, these aren't used as often. To be honest, these use cases that we've talked about, just using justify content and align items, when I'm doing layouts, this is like 90% of what I use with Flexbox. So a little bit of a timeline. Flexbox first appeared. You can see the earliest appearance, I think, was Chrome in 2012. Historically on the web, what people realized very early on in the web was that if you wanted to have a multi-column website, that you could use a table. Now, tables were really never meant for this. And this is actually very problematic in the early web, because remember, the early web is very, very slow. We're talking about like 14.4 modems, in some cases 9600 modems. Very, very, very slow. And what you want to do for users is that as the page starts to load, you want to display content partially. Now, one of the problems with tables was that just inherent to tables, how the rendering engines were, that you couldn't display anything until the whole table was done. So what would happen with your site, and internet connections are so fast today, you probably don't even notice this, but what actually happens typically when you view a site, it actually partially starts to show up. And so you kind of get pieces of the site as it's loading. With table designs, you just get like a hourglass waiting, and then all of a sudden your whole site would pop up. So there was this anti-table movement that don't use tables for your site layouts, but the problem is that for a long time, they didn't give people an alternative. Actually, the old IRC website from like a year ago, going back, that was a tables-based site. If you right-clicked and viewed source, there were tables everywhere. And it was just like, if you needed to do complex layouts, it's like, yeah, it's not a great method to use, but a lot of people still used it. Now what we have instead is something called grid. Grid is almost identical to tables, except for it's meant for layouts, and it's much more powerful. Now, you might be asking, why am I talking about this? We're talking about Flexbox today. Flexbox and grid are like the modern two ways of laying out your site. Now, so you might ask, when do I use a grid and when do I use Flexbox? In general, I think use Flexbox if you're laying out things in one direction. Navigation is a perfect example that we did last class. Or if I need to center things both horizontally and vertically. We're just kind of worrying about one direction. When do I use grid? When I have to worry about things in two directions. When I have to worry about X and Y. So what do I mean by that? Going back to the Audubon Society, if I have these 6 things here laid out, so just by itself, if I just had this one row, I could use Flexbox, no problem. But the issue that we kind of run into is that what if I have 6 things that I want displayed a certain way? Now this is actually a relatively simple layout, but that's the basic idea. They're all the same size. When we get into grid, we'll actually do some more complex examples. But if you're trying to do things in 2 directions, so in this case we've got a row here and a row here, grid is much simpler. Okay, so anytime you're just trying to lay out just one row, think maybe navigation, that's perfect for Flexbox. If you're trying to do things over multiple rows and align them in certain ways, that's going to be grid. Okay. But again, just what we went over, this is probably easily 90% of what most people tend to use Flexbox for. Now there's some stuff with items that's a little bit less used, and it's actually not even on the Flexbox Frog game, but I'm still going to show it to you because it's kind of interesting. The way our content has been growing so far is that everything's been the exact same size. Let me go back to an older example. Let's say maybe example... maybe all the way back to 1. They do the same thing. These boxes are all the same exact size. And if I flex it in the row direction, it's the same deal. Even if I do justify content and space around, they're still all the same size. What you might want to do is change the size based on how much screen area you have. So what I mean is in the modern web, we have to deal with everything from the smallest smartphone all the way up to the largest 4K TVs and even 8K TVs, I guess now. And so what you want is things to flow and dynamically lay out. But at some point, what's going to happen? At some point, you're going to run out of space. And you can see here, they're kind of evenly shrinking. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you want one to shrink at a slower rate than the others. So an example of that is going back to maybe the Audubon Society, all the way up at the top here. Like right now, this is taking up 2/3, 1/3, but if we start losing screen area, maybe you don't need this giant picture. Rather than making this super tiny, maybe you want to set this to shrink a little bit faster so that once we really start to lose some screen real estate, we want them to both take up half. Does that make sense? Is that sometimes it makes sense for something to take up 2/3 and 1/3, but as the screen shrinks and grows, maybe it doesn't make as much sense. Now, I'll be perfectly honest with you. Flexbox isn't the greatest way to do this. Grid is actually really good at this, but let's pretend that we didn't have grid. And since we haven't really talked about it, we really don't. Okay, so let's go all the way back to example 1 as our starting point, and let's copy and paste that into a new. So go all the way back to ex1.html, and let's make that our ex5. We'll do 3 very short examples, and then that'll be it, and you can work on your assignments for the rest of the class. So make sure that you have it the same as me here. I know I changed some things. So set display as flex. We're flexing it in the row direction. Let's get rid of this space around. I'm sorry, this justify content, because it's going to make things a little bit unclear if we have that property. Now the other thing that we also want to do is we want to set something called min width, which guarantees, it says you can be larger than this, but you can never go below a width of 200 pixels on each individual item. And you can see what happens is if I try to actually, because of that min width property, if I try to go smaller, see how it wants to scroll in the horizontal direction? Because I'm saying you can't go any smaller, and the browser's like, well, I don't have any room, so I guess I got to scroll. So inside of the item class, I'm going to set, and this is a little bit different. Remember I told you that some are set on the container, some are set on items. Like, for example, ordering. I don't actually use ordering that much. I can't think of actually ever using ordering in production, because a lot of times stuff is generated from code, so you just modify it in code. But let's talk about this right here, flex grow. So this defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary. So if all items have flex grow set to 1, the remaining space. So remember, this is basically saying if I've got space left over, what do I do with that extra space? So as you remember, min width. So we have 4 items at 200 pixels each, so roughly 800 pixels. There's always, extra stray pixels here and there. But so what we're saying is, if the screen's larger than 800 pixels, I'm going to have some extra room. What do I do with that extra room? Now, with justify content, we might have said, okay, space it out a certain way. But here we can actually do things with the items. So here, what we can say is flex grow. And if we set it to 1, what that means is that all those items are going to grow equally. Now, if we go back here, okay, so this is my 800 pixels, and then what happens? Before, it would have just had extra space, but what do you see now? It's growing equally. I'm going to comment this out. Everyone knows what comments are, correct? Okay, so I'm just going to comment it out so it doesn't run. That's of limited usefulness because remember, item, all 4 of these are of class item. So when I say flex grow, I'm applying it to all 4 items. Maybe I don't want that. Maybe I just want this first div to grow unequally compared to the others. So let's do this. Let's say style equals flex grow to be 1. what do you notice here? Yeah, exactly. This one, so these all have their min width of 200 pixels, which has been satisfied. And it's saying, okay, when you have extra space, what do I want to do with that? Well, here I'm saying allow this first div to grow as needed. But as you start to run out of space, it's going to get back down to a normal size. Now we can actually get even fancier and make multiple of these grow at different rates. So let's do this. Let's copy this. And this is as advanced as we'll get with this example. Think of it almost as like a fraction. So the number 1 is the base, or like maybe like a ratio. And so what this is saying is that when I've satisfied that width of 200 pixels, what do I do with the extra stuff? And it's saying that, okay, this is going to grow at a rate. This is going to grow at twice that rate. This is going to grow at the original rate. This is going to grow at twice the rate. And so here, they essentially look the same size. But as soon as I start to grow, it should be obvious. Notice that this one and this one are growing at twice the rate. But they're still all growing. These didn't stay the same size. These actually did grow. Maybe difficult to see, but they did actually grow. But what's happening is these are growing at twice the rate. Now, I will be perfectly honest. I can't remember really using these ever in a production site. Grid does a pretty decent job at this, but I still wanted to show you that maybe I'm just missing something. I don't want to say it's useless. I'm just saying for my specific types of sites I've worked on, I can't really remember using this. Okay, so any questions on this? So let's go back to, let's use example 1 as our starting point again. Let's copy and paste that. And so again, we want to go back here and we want to get rid of this justify content. Now we've got a flex grow when we've got extra space, but in the other direction we have flex shrink when we run out of space. And so before we had min width, but here min width, so min width says that I can't ever get smaller than this. Width is a little bit more forgiving. Width said, I want to be this size, but if I can't, well, do what you need to do. Okay, so here we're going to have it as width. And so flex shrink defines the ability for an item to shrink if necessary. So it just essentially goes in the other direction. And let's just set it on, because you kind of have the intuition, I think, of how it works. So let's just do it on this first div to save a little bit of time. Say flex shrink. And I'm trying to think how this would lay out, but I'm pretty sure that the others will try to stay 200 pixels, and then this is going to be the only one that shrinks. Let's actually run it to make sure that's actually going to happen. think they're trying to shrink all at the same rate. We might have to set all these. Let's do the 1, 2, 1, 2 thing again. And let's see if this, shrinks at the faster rate. Yeah, so you can see here that this and this shrunk twice as fast. And I think that's as deep as I want to get with these, because again, I don't want to try to make you jump through hoops for stuff I've in practice haven't really seen. Even the game Flexbox Froggy, they don't actually have you do anything with growing and shrinking. They actually mostly stick to just alignments, cross-axis and main axis alignments. One thing they do have you do though is wrap stuff around. So right here we have a property called flex wrap. And I think the first example will be good. And I guess this will be the last example for today. So go back to example 1, copy, paste, save as EX7. Get rid of justify content. So if you remember, the default behavior was to try to resize these. Or if we had set it to min width, we got the scroll bar. But what if instead we said, I want these to be a certain width, and then when you run out of space, put it on the next line. So we have a property for that, but just to let you know, typically actually in Flexbox, we don't actually specify widths a lot of times. What we do instead is we use a property called flex basis, and it serves as the basis. So let's do that. So we'll do each item basis is going to be 200 pixels. It's kind of a more Flexbox terminology. They kind of do similar things, but in certain corner cases or edge cases, they act a little bit differently, and flex basis will actually tend to work better or more intuitively. So when possible, rather than setting a width, try to work with flex basis. And you can kind of think of it like, remember how width, it was just like, that's the size I want to be. Flex basis is kind of the same way. It's saying, I want to be 200 pixels. And so we have this property here on the container called flex wrap. By default, it does no wrap. It doesn't want to wrap. It's going to do that. But what we can do is we can set this property inside of the container, and we can set it to wrap. And then when it runs out of room, so 800 pixels, it's going to force down that item to the next line. We can already actually see that. Now, in practice, I don't actually see this used very often because I think people like a lot of symmetry in their site. So if you've got the site with something like this, it's a little bit messy, but maybe you can think of a usage for it. What happens in practice is that, again, we use grid, and what we can do with grid is say at this, we can use these things called media queries. So grid plus media queries, we can say, okay, at this screen resolution, I want it to look like this. But if we hit to where it's too small. I want it to actually be, like this. So again, the main things you actually tend to use, you tend to use it over a single row or a single column, and we use this justify content and align items. We use both of these all the time. But we typically do it over one row. I'd say the most common thing just right off the bat is going to be navigation. It works really, really, really well for navigation because it lets you do things like this and spread them out evenly. You could do kind of cool things where you put flex boxes inside of flex boxes, and you can get an effect where you can have like some stuff on the right and left, things like this. So you can do all kinds of really, really powerful stuff with Flexbox. But I would avoid it if you've got like a, to me this is an obvious grid layout, because what will happen is that at a certain point you want it to reflow to where it's not like, a grid of 6. So here you might shrink. I don't know if it's gonna. Some sites don't do it that well. We can actually directly just select a phone. Yeah, and then so here it collapsed down to, but anyway. Okay, so again, the main focus is on making sure that you know the terminology. So Flexbox, main axis, cross axis, which direction you're flexing in the row or column direction, justifying content, aligning items. Those are the main things. So your assignment is to go through this game here. And again, for anybody who wasn't here at the beginning of class, students have told me in the past that this is really, really helpful because you've probably already seen from the lecture is that Flexbox has a very steep learning curve. And unlike other things where maybe like doing a full site is helpful, with Flexbox, doing a bunch of small problems actually tends to be more helpful. But because this is like a kind of a popular game for web developers, the answers are out there. I'm telling you the answers are out there. If you cheat, not only are you going to get a 0, you're going to ruin it for everybody else, because I've had a couple people cheat in the past. It's very frustrating because it's a really useful resource. Twitter and other companies went to a lot of effort to make the game, and it gives you a lot of good practice, but you ruin it for everybody because it's like, you're seniors at this point. You should be kind of mature enough to not be tempted to cheat on such a simple thing. Now, what you need to do, so I'll give you the general sense of the way the game works. So I think it actually saves your progress. So let's pretend. So the way it works is this lily pad is fixed. This doesn't change. And then you have to use Flexbox to put the frog in different places. So if you remember, so right now we can see display flex. What's the default direction if it doesn't say anything? Is it row or column? Row. So we're working, so this is the main axis. If I want to put this frog over here, you might have to flip back over and say, okay. And actually they kind of give you some hints. But okay, well, I'm working in the row direction. I want to do something with justify content. And I'm not actually working with a bunch of items. I'm just working with one item. And if I want to force it all the way over here, maybe flex end, and they actually give you some hints. They say this problem uses justify content, and then they give you the different values of it. So you might say, okay, justify content, and it's great because as you're typing real time, it'll move the frog around. So you might experiment, say, okay, well, is it center? No, that didn't make it. Is it space around? No, that didn't work. And you might say, oh, okay, well, if I want to force it to the end, flex end might be what I need. Okay, and then, so what you'll need to do is after you've completed the last level I have you do, take a screenshot of this drop down. Don't just take a screenshot of you on level 14 because obviously, you could have just clicked through and gone to level 14. So what I need you to do is actually take a screenshot of this, and it should show a bunch of green all the way up to that level. Yes?
Are you going to post the website with the Flexbox and all that kind of stuff, or are we not? Reference?
It should be under,
Oh, is it already there?
yeah. The main one, this other site just has some examples of when you would use it. This one could be maybe kind of useful, but yeah, the CSS tricks one, that's just labeled Flexbox. Okay, is everyone good for this game? You understand how you're supposed to, and again, you're just doing a screenshot and upload the screenshot. Yeah.
How would you screenshot it?
Well, on your computer, it would be Shift Command 4.
Oh.
Like, so if you press Shift Command 4, this one actually, you need to press there, yep, and then you just drag the mouse.
What is that? Just so it's recorded. It's you said it's Shift Command 4 on Macs.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then that'll probably, I think it goes straight to your desktop.
Oh.
And then you can,
I should probably put that in the assignment.
Yeah, I see.
I don't know how to do it.
Okay.
Shift Command F4, correct?
No, just Shift Command 4.
Oh, I don't know why I thought. The number 4.
Yeah, and then you have to like drag the mouse, like press down, drag the mouse, but and then
To select an area? Okay,
yeah, it gives you
perfect.
like a crosshair and then
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.